Today I'm really delighted to welcome Professor Nakayama for our last session of the year. Professor Nakayama is a professor of American politics and foreign policy at the Faculty of Policy Management at Keio University in Japan. He spent in this academic year in Washington, D.C. at the Wilson Center. And he has had a very interesting career. He spent his formative year, 1 year in high school in South Dakota. That's where he got initiated to American culture and American life. And he's had a career both in academia and in the more of a policy world, having worked at the as a special assistant at the permanent mission of Japan to the United Nations in New York. He also had an appointment as a special correspondent for the Washington Post at the Far Eastern Bureau. And he has worked at major think tanks like the Brookings Institution in the US and the Japan Institute of International Affairs in Japan. So he's somebody who's very knowledgeable, both the policy world and the academic world in terms of foreign relations, foreign affairs, international relations, and so on. And he's published a number of books and articles, both in English and in Japanese. And he's very well connected to the policy world in Japan as well, having advised a lot of committees at the Japanese government level. And if you have spent some time in Japan in the last few years, you may have seen him on TV. He's on media a lot, both print media and the broadcast media, semi-regular at the Sunday debate shows in Japan, semi-regular at Sunday debate shows in Japan. So we are very privileged to have him here to talk about his views on foreign affairs, international relations in the world today, especially under the Trump foreign policy regime, and how that may be affecting US-Japan relations, and how that in turn may be affecting the world. Okay. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Nakayama.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, Professor Tsutsui. I'm really honored to be here and honored to be participate in the event sponsored by Center for Japanese Studies, which Professor Tsutsui heads right now. And I have to correct one point. And he mentioned that for the past couple of years, if you're in Japan, you will see me on broadcast television. But that hasn't happened in the past 2 years or so. The reason is because I was, I guess as many of you were as well, I was wrong about the result of the election in 2016. I was on live television covering the election back in Japan. And when the program started, I just talked about what the Clinton administration would be like, what US-Japan relation would be under President Clinton and all that. But things didn't turn out that way, right? So I guess the media wants people who got things right. So I'm not the Trump person, I'm the loser. So since January of 2017, the media hasn't been calling me all that much, right? So I have to correct on that point. Today, I'd like to talk about how Japan has been dealing with this team in Washington right now. And as I think many of you are aware, Japan, among the so-called Western democracies, is one of the few, in fact, maybe the only country who is quite effectively and successfully managing the relation up until now. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. But at least up until now, we've been handling Mr. Trump quite successfully. And the interesting thing is that there's a public support towards that as well. So I want to describe the sort of the background of that dynamic. Why is Japan seemingly comfortable in sort of hugging Trump? Is Japan a full-blown democracy? Right? So that's the kind of question that I want to address. So a little bit of a introduction, although Professor Tsutsui kindly introduced what I have been doing. I teach American politics and American foreign policy and US-Japan relations in Keio University in Tokyo. And because of all the reasons that I've stated, it's not an easy subject to teach these days. And also, I will generalize that the US is, everybody thinks that they know about the US because there's many cultural influences, the movies, the music, Starbucks is all over Tokyo. So I guess the general perception of the Japanese university student is the US something you want to study in university? We know about the US already. Right? That's the sort of the general perception about the US. But then things like the election of the 2016 happens. And it turns out that we don't know much about this country, that this is something that we've never imagined or we've experienced. So I think there's a general feeling that we have to understand the US more. So I think the relevance of American studies in Japan is increasing as a result of Trump phenomena. So in that really small, tiny area, it's benefiting me to a certain degree that Mr. Trump is in the White House. But more generally, I think it poses us with a very serious question. And that's the kind of subject that I want to address. And by the way, I'm now at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. I think this is the best of American sort of public diplomacy. Right? It's partly funded by the State Department, sort of gathering scholars from around the world and just give us a space and time to study. And you can do basically whatever you want, as long as it's relevant to what's going on today. And I've been a Japan fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center since last September. So I'll start the topic. Well, maybe I should start out with the election in 2016, and that whenever there would be a presidential election, that Japan would always complain that Japan is never mentioned during the elections. Right? So now you can, count how many times a word has been uttered by president. Right? You just search the text, and you would easily come out with the numbers. So the typical thing that Japanese journalists would do after a presidential candidate would deliver a speech on foreign policy, or on, not maybe on East Asia, but on foreign policy, they would find China mentioned 10, 20 times, but Japan, none, right? So we used to always complain about that. But I guess looking back, that's a good thing, right? You don't want to be mentioned in the presidential candidates' speeches, because if you were mentioned, you would mostly have some issues with the US. So the fact that Japan was mentioned was a good news for Japan, but it felt like we're being marginalized, that Japan may no longer be relevant. Right? That was kind of the sentiment before 2016. But then you come to 2016, and you have Mr. Trump during the Republican primaries, and he would never forget to mention about Japan. He would talk, of course, he talked about China a lot, but he never forgot to mention about Japan as well. The way he sort of talked about Japan is that, Japan is basically in the same category with China in terms of trade. And they're cheaters. They don't do business or trade according to the rules. So it's not fair. That's the first message. And the second message was that we're protecting Japan. We're paying all the money for it. And if Japan wants to protect it, they have to pay. They're free riders. That was the message that Mr. Trump sent. And the third message, although to be fair, he said this only once, but back in March of 2016, he said that, lumping together with some other countries like Korea and Germany, that if Japan wants to go nuclear, go ahead and do it. Japan can go nuclear if they want. Right? And that really sort of shocked us in a very serious way, because nuclear deterrence, right, is at the core of US-Japan alliance. it's not that U.S. would always be willing to use nuclear weapons in any occasion, right? But as a last resort, if some adversaries sort of threat Japan's national security or a sovereign place where that's governed by Japan, U.S. would not rule out using nuclear weapons to defend that with Japan. So that will be a symbolic message that you shouldn't be sort of threatening Japan, because we would always be ready to use nuclear weapons. Not that U.S. would use weapons all the time. But if you say that Japan can go nuclear if you want, it almost means that we're not going to come and protect Japan, right? So it did sort of have some impact here, but it had a way more bigger impact back in Japan. That maybe if he becomes the president, maybe we'd have to think beyond the alliance, right? That was kind of the perception that we had during the election. But we've learned that it turns out Mr. Trump would become the president. So 10 days after the election, that is in November of 2016, Prime Minister Abe decides to go visit President-elect Trump to Trump Tower in Manhattan. And this was totally against diplomatic protocol, right? Because you only have one president at a time. And a sitting leader of a nation is not supposed to sort of meet and say hello to a president-elect. And I heard that the White House quite explicitly showed that they're uncomfortable with Prime Minister's visit to the Trump Tower. But I guess they've ignored. And that's how desperate they were when they've learned that Mr. Trump is going to be the president. So going back a bit, back in September of 2016, when Prime Minister Abe visited New York to attend the General Assembly of the United Nations, he met Hillary Clinton without meeting Donald Trump. Right? That's almost like an intervention in electoral affairs. Like, if a prime minister meets one candidate, it's like I'm endorsing him or her. So I guess the prime minister's office was really worried that Mr. Trump would remember this, that just ignoring the diplomatic protocol, that they had to go meet President Trump in November. So that's how desperate we were. And one very sort of famous diplomat in Singapore said that, in Europe, and this was an article in Foreign Affairs published right after like March in, I think, 2017. He said that in that article that, in Europe, people are panicked about Trump, but in Asia, we will just adapt, right? And we would not complain. That's how he portrayed the reaction in Asia. But I would say Japan went even further than that, and that our adaptation to Mr. Trump's regime and team was radical. Right? It was a radical adaptation to what Mr. Trump represented, and the whole sort of his understanding of foreign policy and all that. So I call that a strategic hugging, which have been successful up until now. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. But I would think that it would have been very difficult for a leader in Germany, Chancellor Merkel, Prime Minister May, or President Macron, to have hugged Mr. Trump the way Prime Minister Abe did. And I think his fellow citizens in France, UK, or Germany would have supported their leaders hugging of Mr. Trump if they had decided to do so. Right? But in Japan, it's not just Mr. Abe, but I think the hugging was supported by the general public, that he's doing the right thing. And I think there's several reasons behind that. The reason why Japanese public in general, business leaders, political leaders supported the sort of embracement of Mr. Trump. I would say there's like four reasons. One is quite straightforward, and I think it has to do with the security situation in Northeast Asia. Situation in Northeast Asia is quite tricky. There's a lot of tensions, territorial issues, geopolitical, geoeconomic competitions, and of course it's all about the rising China and the uncertainty about where that regime is going. Right? China's rise per se is not a bad news for Japan. China is an opportunity as well. It's a possibility. But if you add up some of the things that China is doing in the region from a Japanese perspective, we see a sort of a, maybe it's a very strong word, but some sort of a hegemonic ambition that they're trying to establish a China-centric order, although it's not the word that China would use. Right? They would never use that kind of word. But we see that in their actions. And of course, you see a contingency on, or possible contingency on Korean Peninsula. So the issue on Korean Peninsula is a short to midterm, and the rise of China is a very long term, could be 50, maybe even more than that, right? I think China is playing a long game. And in that context, I always sort of half jokingly, seriously say that Japan is a very lonely country. Right? The only formal alliance we have is with the United States. We have difficult relations with immediate neighbors, although Korea shares the same kind of political values and same kind of political system. Because of the history issues, there are always tensions. And with regard to how we approach China, the way the Koreans approach China and the way we approach China is quite different. Right? Like I said, Japan is the only country in the region which would explicitly say that China-centric order is not good for the region. We're going to resist to it. Right? Resist means not just going into war or anything. It's about rule-making, about political values. But we're uncomfortable with China-centric order, and we're quite explicit about that. But many countries, I would say all the countries, have difficulties with China's, this dynamic surge in the region, but less and less country would complain about it vocally, right? So, like if you go to Southeast Asia, they would say geography is a map. China is always right up there. And yes, US is now here, but they can leave. Right? If you talk to the Aussies or the people in New Zealand, Australians could sometimes be tough on China, but their natural reaction would be, and maybe that's more relevant to New Zealand, but you can't really shape China's rise. And if you can't shape China's rise, you might as well adapt to it. Right? So that's kind of although they're comfortable and sometimes disturbed by what China is doing, I think that will be the general attitude in Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. So Japan is the only country who is explicitly saying that we would resist. Although recently there have been some rapprochement between Beijing and Tokyo. I see that as not an expression of a long trend, but it could always go bad. And if you look back, Japan-China relations in the past 7 or 8 years, it's been like -10. So I think we're just pushing back to like -1 or 0. So it's not like we're having a friendly relationship or anything, right? So that's where we are, and that's why I say Japan is lonely in that context. But that's our position. So we need a friend to stand sort of by us. Right? And the only country that will be willing to stand by us in that context is the US. And I think there's a general understanding of that even among the Japanese public. Right? So that's the first point, the reason why people support prime minister's hugging of Mr. Trump. And this number is fascinating. There's a cabinet office polling conducted every year. And in 2017, right, this is the first year of the Trump administration, you would ask the Japanese people, this is the public, not just the policy experts, Japanese public, how important is US-Japan relations to Japan, the region? And the answer would be 95.1%. And the next year, the second year of the Trump administration, it's still 94.5%. So all other countries in the world are so worried that they're talking about America's retrenchment, isolationism, America first. Japan just, not that we're not worried, but we still sort of believe that relations, no matter who the president is, the relations with the United States is critically important. And that is shared by the Japanese public as well. I'm sure you know that Japan is a democracy. And in a democracy, you don't get, if you do a polling, and you don't get a 90% answer, right? So this is almost like a unanimous support. So that's the first reason. And the second reason is about, populist nationalism. Right? In Japan, well, in many of the Western democracies, you see a surge of populist nationalism. Right? The Brexit, the Le Pen in France, and AfD in Germany. And of course here you see the Trump phenomena. Right? So many of the Western democracies are now haunted by this populist nationalist movement. But in Japan, you don't see that. You don't see this populist nationalism surging. Right? People used to doubt whether Prime Minister Abe was a dangerous conservative or not, especially when he was a prime minister in his first term. That was in the mid-2000s. But in his second term, starting in 2012, he has been pretty pragmatic, and he hasn't been sort of playing around with these identity issues, right? These nationalistic agendas. And he has been governing in a very sort of pragmatic, economic-oriented policy. So I think it's not fair, and you can't label what Mr. Abe represents as a populist nationalism. It's quite opposite to that. So when Macron, Merkel, and May sees Trump and Trump phenomena, they see in those movements that, what they see in their own countries, right? That it's a threat to a democratic governance within their own country. And the fact that Trump phenomena resonates with that, and Mr. Trump seems totally comfortable with that, makes it difficult for them to support or embrace Trump fully. Right? So there's an embedded uncomfortableness across the Atlantic. Right? But because we don't have that in Japan, we don't see the dark side of Trump phenomena, right? The nationalist, populist element. Or I'm not saying that Mr. Trump himself is a white nationalist. I'm not going to go into that. But you see some of the white nationalist sentiment that is comfortable with Mr. Trump. And I'm sure Merkel, May, and Macron is totally disturbed by that. But we're not because we're not interested in those issues, but because we're not facing those issues, right? So I would say that's the second reason. And the other reasons that we don't have a populist, nationalist, like fake news attacking, a political movement is, I think this is in fact a good thing, that the Japanese politicians are so not social media savvy. They're really bad, right? I mean, there are some who has many followers, but most of them are boring. It doesn't have sort of electoral impact, right? So sort of in the public sphere, social media is quite influential. But in the political sphere, I don't think social media has all that much of a big impact back in Japan. And also, I would say that in Japan, people actually still read printed newspapers, right? Although the number of the publication of the print media is going down compared to other countries, it's still up there. And I would say these two elements, the fact that the politicians are not social media savvy and the fact that we still read print newspapers, is a strong, a guard against populist nationalism, right? So maybe you would think about reviving the print media, although that would be, I guess, is extremely difficult. And the third element is, I think, specific to maybe Asia in general, that it's a contrast to President Obama. And maybe it's kind of difficult to imagine that, what do you mean? Mr. Trump is much more popular than President Obama? I guess that would be the reaction that you would have. But partly it is so, right? But I have to start out by saying that President Obama was a really popular president back in Japan. Right? The most obvious reason, well, there's some, but his message about a world without nuclear weapons, of course, that would resonate in Japan. Right? The citizens of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, mayors of the two cities, they all welcome, finally, the moment has come, kind of reaction to President Obama's Global Zero, or world without nuclear weapons. And the fact that he visited Hiroshima and gave a very moving speech, right? It wasn't just about niceties. And we never demanded President Obama to apologize because we knew it wasn't about apologies. It was about reconciliation, right? And we knew that some in his team was opposed to his visit to Hiroshima. So it was Ambassador Kennedy herself and President Obama himself who was really keen and eager to visit Hiroshima. Right? And we were always hearing that he would deliver a brief sort of statement. But he delivered a 30-minute speech. And for the Japanese people, that was very moving. And right after his visit to Hiroshima, close to 95% of the Japanese people really appreciated President Obama's visit. And I would say that may be the most closest moment where the minds of the Japanese people and American sort of president sort of came close. Right? So there was kind of synergy. And right after that visit, our prime minister visited Pearl Harbor for the first time as a sitting prime minister. Or did Prime Minister Yoshida? I got confused. But it wasn't a public visit. It was a first public visit by a sitting prime minister. And he laid a wreath to this memorial, which wouldn't have been possible without President Obama visiting Hiroshima. So there was this general acceptance toward President Obama. But I have to say that President Obama is a really, I think, one of the most intelligent and sophisticated thinkers that you've had as a president. His view of the world is really nuanced. I appreciate that. But does that assure him being a good president or a good commander-in-chief? And sadly, maybe not. Right? The reason is that his view of the world, we sometimes call him a postmodern president, right? That he wasn't sort of interested in like the 19th century, 20th century clash of nations type. To him, the existential threat that the U.S., this country is facing, and the human race is facing, is issues like, nuclear weapons. So we should have an aspiration to get rid of all that. Pandemics, it could destroy human race, and issues like global warming. And no doubt, they are critically important, right? U.S. has to play a leadership role, no doubt. No one disagrees with that. But in addition to those, stance on those issues, he was so aloof and disinterested in great power competitions and arms race that was occurring in East Asia. Right? He said that's not a first-tier issue. We can shake hands with China, although he got a bit tougher in his second term. So, although President Obama was welcomed, from the Japanese public, and his view of the world was very much appreciated in real politique sphere, there's always doubt about whether he would commit to the region or he would commit to the alliance. Right? To be fair, he said all the right things about the alliance. He said what all the presidents said in the past, so he was totally okay on that front. But like, what he did on Syria and what he did on Ukraine, Crimea, and the most shocking message that we've received, it wasn't directed to us, but with regard to Crimea, he said that in a longer term, Russia has bigger stake and interest in Crimea. So there's not much that U.S. can do, and there shouldn't be much that we would do, because it's going to be another intervention. Right? So if you apply that to some islands around Japan, our natural response would be that, yes, he's saying all the right things, but can we really trust him? And he seems to see China not as a sort of a strategic competitor, but as a more or less a partner. Or if partner is too strong of a word, someone who can sort of cooperate with. Right? So there was this doubts about Obama in the first place. So in 2014, the Japanese government adopted a policy called peace and security legislation. Right? This was to expand what Japan can do in terms of defending ourselves, and in that context, cooperating with the U.S. forces, right? So we would define it, in a very within the sort of the maximum within our legal framework. So we were criticized by some of the neighbors as becoming, hawkish and all that. And on that sort of cover of that sort of legislation, it says this is to prepare. I mean, it's not literally, but it says that this is to prepare for China's rise and contingencies on Korean Peninsula. But the hidden motivation behind that was to tell the Americans and the Obama team that we're going to do the maximum within the legal framework, so you would have to stay in East Asia. That was the message. So there was worries about American retractment or American reluctance, even during the Obama era. So in a way, what we're seeing in Mr. Trump, is not totally new. We see a certain continuation in that respect. But Mr. Trump is tougher on China. Right? We don't know how he's going to follow through on that. But if you see his national security documents, like the National Security Strategy published in late 2017, and the other document published in early 2010, National Defense Strategy. In those documents, they treat China as a strategic competitor, right? Not an enemy, almost as an adversary, clearly as a competitor, a strategic competitor. So that's the third reason, the strong contrast with Obama. was the third reason Japanese people felt comfortable, not comfortable, but sort of supported Mr. Abe's embrace of Mr. Trump. And fourth, this is a bit difficult to say, but for I always pay attention to what's going on here in the US. I try to follow the news, the popular cultures and all that, the conservative side and the liberal side as well. I don't take position because I'm not an American, I just try to understand. But for many Japanese, the image that they have about this country and the American people is quite naturally stereotyped, right? And in a way, Mr. Trump is a typical American. He's loud, brash, and arrogant, right? And that's the typical image an ordinary Japanese would have about the American people. No offense, it's not myself thinking so. So the natural reaction will be, yeah, he's not the typical person, but he's the typical American, right? And what do you have to be surprised about that? You just gotta adapt to it. Right? That kind of I've never polled this, do you think Mr. Trump is an ordinary American? I don't think there's any polls like that. But I think, talking to Japanese business leaders outside of Tokyo, that's the kind of perception that I've got. Right? So, I think Prime Minister Abe went too far, or goes too far sometimes, in embracing Mr. Trump. Like the case where he's, right after the election, the two leaders met in, was it Buenos Aires? He said he congratulated Mr. Trump for the historic victory of 2018 midterm elections. Right? That's a bit too much. Right? and also, he didn't deny nor said he did, but at least Mr. Trump said that Prime Minister Abe or the government of Japan nominated Mr. Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize. Right? And I think that's a bit too much. But generally speaking, there's a common understanding that you have to try to have a good relation with the American president, because collectively it's the president you chose, right? No matter who you voted for in the 2016 election. So I was in Brazil this February, and Brazil have their own Trump problem, right, in the shape of Bolsonaro. But they said that Bolsonaro has a limit because there's a strong anti-American feeling in Brazil, strong feeling of distrust towards the Monroe Doctrine, which John Bolton and others sometimes uses these days. And turning to the issue of Japan and talking to the Brazilians, why is Japan so comfortable? Japan is economically a big country. It has, although it's not surging as we used to did it back in the 80s and 90s, we're still we're not a middle power, right? Although we're not a superpower. I think I'd like to at least categorize Japan as a country, a nation with a global scope, right? Not just in sort of immediate vicinity of our geographical areas. And the Brazilians would ask me that, why are you so comfortable, and why are you so reliant on US-Japan alliance? Right? That's the questions that I always got giving a lecture in Brazil. And then if you think of other options that Japan could have besides the US-Japan alliance, right? I think sort of intellectually, doing the experiment, I think there's several. Right? I can come out with 5. One is pacifism as it is laid out in our Constitution. Maybe some of you have read the Constitution that you partly drafted. And in the Article 9, we're not supposed to have a military force, no Army, Navy, Air Force, nothing. And of course, as a result of that, we're not allowed to use those tools to resolve foreign policy issues. Right? That's our Constitution. So why not return to that original idealism, right? Back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, there was a school who really believed in that during the Cold War. Right? We shouldn't take sides. We should be totally neutral, like Switzerland of East Asia. Well, that's the term MacArthur, General MacArthur sort of favorite, right? But these days, because of what's happening on Korean Peninsula, and you see the rise of China, and not many people are for sort of Japan going back to that pacifist roots. And I would even say that it is irresponsible for a country like Japan to be totally, disarm itself, because it would create a power vacuum. Right? So a country like Japan has to be able to defend itself. So I think going back to the pacifist route is not an option. Right? So what about the total opposite of the Trump proposition? Japan going becoming a full-blown military power, even going nuclear. Right? This is also extremely unrealistic, but if you sometimes read in the papers that it seems like some people are worried about Japan's rise, becoming hawkish and all that. But I would say that, yes, we've been more assertive in some of the areas, and we've been expanding our sort of defense budget a little. But I would say that we are as aggressive as like Canada. Right? I mean, it's what you compare with. Yes, we're hawkish than before, but we're not even as assertive as Canada. There's so many limits that we can do. Right? So Japan becoming a dangerous nation, first of all, is totally incorrect, I think. But more than that, the reason why this Japan becoming a full-blown military power is not realistic is because we don't have the money to do that. There's no public support. Japanese youngsters would never, want to join the military. It's just not in their sort of thinking, right? That element was totally marginalized in the post-war period. And lastly, but maybe most importantly, the countries around the region, of course, Korea, China, but even Southeast Asia, if we become a full-blown military power and even go nuclear, I think they will be extremely comfortable. And the nuclear option would kick us out from the various international regimes, right? Like NPT, we would probably be sanctioned by the UN Security Council, and we don't want to go that route. So a full-blown military power, I don't think, is a fantasy, as the pacifist route is. So what about, other alliances, besides the U.S.? I've said that U.S. is the only alliance that we have, right? So we are deepening and expanding security cooperations with countries like Australia, India. France is interested as well, believe it or not, and UK, quite naturally because they're feeling kind of lonely these days. And we did have some successful alliances with the UK in the early part of the 20th century, and it is in fact the first formal sustaining alliance that UK had, right? So, and it was to sort of counter the Russian expansion in the Far East. It was really effective. So yes, it's still a talking phase. So we are talking about like quasi alliance with UK. But it's going to take some time. And it's not going to replace the alliance that we have with the US. Because if we have some territorial contingency with the Chinese Navy, would the Indian Navy come and help us? That is totally out of the question, right? It simply is not going to happen. So the option of other alliances is not realistic. Right? And in terms of, what about then regional organization? Is there a multilateral solution? there are many multilateral frameworks in our part of the regions, but they're not result-oriented, unfortunately. Right? They are useful in its own ways, but some people say that it's a talk shop, that the leaders just gather and talk about the issues, but it's not solution or result-oriented. So if there's some serious territorial issues, sort of military disputes between major countries, it's simply not going to function. Right? And the global institutions like the UN Security Council in particular, it is supposed to resolve serious issues in international affairs. But just think about who's the representing veto-holding permanent member of Security Council. It's China, right? And we've been raising our hand since the early 90s that we would want to join the Security Council. Maybe we don't need a veto. It's better to have it, but maybe we don't need it, but we want to just join in the conversation. Because there are serious things happening in East Asia, and it's not healthy that China is the only representative of Asia. But guess who's been blocking that? Right? So UN Security Council is not the answer. So that leaves you with only one option, right? Almost. And that's the alliance with the US. And so in that sense, Japan is a country without plan B. I hate to say this, but Japan is a country without plan D. And I think the people realize that, and the leaders realize that as well. Right? So, but the fortunate thing is that, yes, it is the only option. But among the options that we could think of, it is the best option that we have. So as a result of that, the general consensus in Japan is that for now, let's don't complain about Mr. Trump's tweet or what he says on specific policies, but just try to convince the Trump team, the American public, that you have to be, a resident power in East Asia or Asia Pacific. And I think that's what our neighbors want Japan to do as well, right? Because in trying to convince the US among the countries in East Asia, I think Japan has a bigger voice in trying to convince the US. And if other countries do that, it seems like they're taking positions between US and China, right? So they will be a bit hesitant in doing so publicly. But because Japan, in a way, has chosen, we don't have to worry about that. We could be totally vocal about trying to convince the US that US has to be a resident power in the Asia Pacific. I've been saying the reason why, Japan needs the US, but I think this relations is not a one-way street. I think it's good for the US as well, and it's a good deal for the US as well. Right? I was in London this March. I love going to London. Europe is my favorite destination. They have good museums, wines and cheese and all that. But nothing against Europe, but they're not sort of the dynamic economic center of the world, right? Look at Middle East. It's a very important region for the United States, but it is almost about dealing with problems or negative issues, right? So it's not about possibilities. In Africa, there are possibilities, but it will take some time, right? It's not the dynamic center of world economy. East Asia is. It's not just China. Southeast Asia, Korea, Japan is still, up there. So in order for US to sort of join that, dynamics, you have to be a resident power in Asia Pacific. And you have been a resident power since early 20th century, or maybe even beyond that. Michael Green of Georgetown University writes about US being a resident power, even in the early 19th century. Right? But the problem for you is that you're not physically located in East Asia. You're geographically not there. So there's doubts, right, in Southeast Asia, that China is always up there, but US could always leave. So you would need a good partner where you can sort of poll as being a resident power. You have many allies in the region. You have Korea. Taiwan, not an ally. You can't really station troops in a major way in Taiwan, but you have a partner in Taiwan, Thai, Philippines, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, US sort of alliance is coming back. And there's Japan, right? And if you compare among those countries, staying or having a base in Japan is quite effective, I would say. Our former Prime Minister, Nakasone, used to call the Japan archipelago a unsinkable aircraft carrier. I think we really have to thank Prime Minister Abe, because this is the kind of word that penetrates into Mr. Trump's mind, right? An unsinkable aircraft carrier, right? Therefore, Japan is important, right? So I think this is a really good word to convince Mr. Trump of the importance of the US-Japan alliance. But it's not just Mr. Trump, but the fact that we are a long and stable democracy. Even before, World War II, in the Taisho democracy period, there was a sort of culture of democracy. And, something went wrong in the 30s and 40s, but, we've sort of, with the help of the US, we reestablished that culture and institution. And since then, we have been a very stable, sometimes too stable, right? As a result, it could be a bit boring. But look at the things happening around the world. A bit boring may be good, right? So Japan is a very stable democracy. And also, and like I said, there's no populist nationalism. And affinity towards the US is very strong. It's a very pro-American nation. Right? And we share many of the desirable orders that we should have in our region. A rule-based, open, and free international order. That's the kind of order that we would want. And the basis in Japan, although there are continuously issues happening around the bases, some unfortunate things. Some unfortunate things happened just recently as well. So there are incidents, especially in the island of Okinawa. There are frictions. But generally speaking, the last time we had a major anti-American based movement in Japan is half a century ago. Since then, there hasn't been any. Right? That was when this campus, Ann Arbor, was was one of the centers of Students for Democratic Society, right? So it's a long time ago. And since then, we've never had a substantial anti-American based movement. So compared with other countries, I'm not saying get rid of all the other countries, they're all important, but as a substantial base in East Asia, Japan is the best option for you as well. So that makes, I think, US-Japan relations very important and very stable, despite all the hurricanes and the turbulence in the Trump era. So, I always end up by saying that, even under the Trump administration, for Japan, it is almost as business as usual in trying to sort of maintain and deepen the US-Japan alliance. It's the only option that we have, but it is the best option that we have. And I think Prime Minister Abe is doing that. And I have my own difficulties about some parts of Prime Minister Abe's policy, but overall, as a commander-in-chief of, who is in charge of security of Japan, I am in support of Prime Minister and his strategic hugging of Mr. Trump. So I will end at that. Thank you very much.
We'll take some questions.
Thank you so much for that. Will the continued rise of China make it possible for Japan and Russia to have a peace treaty?
That's a difficult one. Should I answer one by one? Yeah. That's one of the elements that I don't quite agree with what Prime Minister Abe is doing. It's in terms of balance of power, it is totally rational to sort of sort of separate China and Russia, right? Because China and Russia sort of ganging up together on Western sort of liberal order is bad for Japan, right? And that's partly Prime Minister Abe's logic. To counter China's side, we have to pull Russia on our side. And he sees the possibility of Japan and Russia sort of, we don't have a peace treaty yet, after the World War II, because we have territorial issues, right? And territorial issues is one of the core identity issues that Prime Minister and some of the, or many of the Japanese public have. But I don't see a realistic possibility of Japan sort of, gaining or Russians returning the northern territories to Japan. So I simply cannot understand how he is seeing President Putin's decision or options. And I'm sometimes fear that he's being sort of played around by Putin, because I don't see any way out from this entanglement that we have with Russia. So I don't have a clear-cut answer, but it has a rationale in trying to separate Russia and China, but I don't think that's going to happen quite easily.
Thank you so much for sharing your refreshingly direct and very intelligent sharing of your view on a diverse set of topics. However, I remain to be convinced that from the perspective of Japan as a nation state, and most importantly, the Japanese people, the only realistic and the best option, as you choose to put it, is the continuing strengthening, or at least continuation, of the US-Japan alliance.
Right.
That is specifically as ethnic Chinese wishing that the relationship between Japan and China will improve, perhaps going back to its heyday of the 1980s, if not better.
Right.
Why isn't that a real option for Japan, the nation, and the people of Japan?
Well, I would say that China has changed dramatically. Japan has changed as well. But more than that, the role that Chinese leadership see in the region in the future is dramatically different from what we perceived back in the 1980s, right? So going back to 1980s, where we talked about Japan-China friendship, that was the term that you thought about when you were talking about Japan-China relation, right? Japan-China friendship. Now it's almost like an oxymoron. And if you talk to young people, they would not even know that term, Nichu Yuko, Japan-China friendship, right? So the geostrategic environment in East Asia and Northeast Asia has dramatically changed. And Japan-China relation does not exist in a vacuum, right? It exists in a regional context where there is a competition, where one country is rising and the other becoming rather stagnant,
and the stagnant see the rising country as trying to establish a hegemonic power. And more, the Japanese people and the Japanese leaders see that kind of ambition in Chinese actions. Although rhetorically it's changing a bit in a couple of months, right? Made in China 2025 is not being used anymore and those kind of things. But we don't see that as a fundamental change. So I think it's going to be really difficult to return to the 1980s. And simply, I don't think it's possible. We have to come out with another cooperative scheme or something.
Are you aware of the fact that Xi Jinping is going to visit Japan
Sure.
in June?
Yeah.
The Foreign Secretary of Japan recently was in Beijing
Sure.
and signed an agreement that will hopefully
Right.
result in 30,000 youngsters as part of an exchange program, which are, seems to me, positive signs for the future.
Hopefully these cultural exchanges would mend the difficult relations. But I kind of doubt it. But one good thing is that there are multiple channels between China and Japan. It's not just like geopolitical competition all over, right? As civil society contacts, universities have contacts, professionals have contact. So those multiple sort of contact points may sort of ease some tensions. But if it comes to real serious geopolitical tensions, I doubt whether those would be enough. We would have a specific mechanism to deal with those kind of geostrategic tensions.
So as you noted at the outset, the Japanese government's been more successful in maintaining a favorable relationship with the Trump government, despite the Trump administration's erraticism and other problems. For that reason, some have looked to the Japanese government to actually carry messages to Washington to try to impact the Trump administration's behaviors in ways that have been tough to influence through domestic channels.
Right.
And we've seen evidence of efforts to do that. We've also seen evidence of cases in which Japan seems to have been neglected, like in the announcement of the summit with Kim Jong-un. What's your impression of the current state of play with this version of Trump Team 6.0 or wherever we are, where the Japanese government has access to decision making? Who are the people or what are the institutions through which you think Japan has the greatest say in U.S. foreign policy?
Oh, thank you for that. This is really odd. Yeah, this is 6.0 or whatever, right? But it is at the top level, the most important contact. And I think Mr. Trump's affinity towards Mr. Abe is genuine. Because if you go to like a G7 summit, right, you would see Chancellor Merkel, Prime Minister May, Macron, sort of like preaching and trying to teach Mr. Trump about liberal international or the open borders and all that, right? What we should do. But Mr. Abe, I guess, never does that. He doesn't preach. He listens. He tries to accommodate. And you don't see that kind of reactions from other democracies, other advanced democracies, right? Not that Mr. Abe is in support of specific Trump agenda, but I think his whole sole purpose is to manage U.S.-Japan alliance, right? And as a result of that, because Mr. Abe has fully embraced Mr. Trump, I think Mr. Trump's affinity towards Mr. Abe is genuine. I don't know whether that feeling is reciprocated. I simply don't know. But I'm sure Mr. Abe knows clearly what he's doing. So it's not like at the ambassadorial level or like a Ministry of Foreign Affairs level. In the Trump era, that's not reliable. You have to be able to talk to President Trump. And I think as of now, like I said, we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. But as of now, Mr. Abe is the one who can speak to Mr. Trump directly, look into his eyes and talk directly. So he's going to come to Washington next week. He's going to meet Prime Minister. The two is going to meet when there would be a change in the emperor, and then he would visit again. Probably, maybe it would be Mr. Pence. I don't know. But as of now, he's going to come to Japan twice in more than a month, right? So the reason, because Mr. Trump is willing to do that, is the personal affinity. So the what was that? I forgot. Some media outlet was saying that Japan's basic strategy towards Mr. Trump is personal relations and extreme flattery. Right? I call that a pref strategy, right? And it's working. So, and there's nothing really that we can do. So we're just doubling down on that. It may look funny. You can make fun of it, but I think that's working.
So quite related to that, is there any concern that by visibly, as you say, hugging Mr. Trump, that Abe may damage relationships with the future U.S. administration and the Democrats who may remember this?
I get warned in my friends from the Democratic side all the time. We understand what you're doing, but you're clearly overdoing it. Right? That's the advice I get. And I understand. But if you see what's happening on the Democratic side, that worries us as well. You see Bernie Sanders. Right? You see Elizabeth Warren. And like, I don't know, in 20, 30 years, maybe AOC might be running for president, right? And they have their own version of America first. Very different from Mr. Trump's, but limited global engagement, nation building at home, no more interventions. You know, America, there's a limit to what America can do, so we should just stop. Right? And Mr. Trump, in Mr. Trump's case, isn't really a conviction or ideological set of worldviews. It's just instinctively he's doing that, right? But in case of like Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, I think they're more firm believers in those kind of stance and, if you can call it, a doctrine. So when I read Elizabeth Warren's article in Foreign Affairs, published a couple of months ago, it was about what not U.S. should do outside of the country. So in a sense, the democratic version of America first is as worrying as Mr. Trump's. Right? So if a centrist, we don't care if it's a Republican nor a Democrat, if he or she is a centrist. But we don't see the energy in the center these days. So we're now doubling down on Trump, and you can be critical of that, because in 2020, who knows, maybe it will be, as of the polls now, President Sanders, right? I don't know whether that's going to happen or not. But that will be even more of a nightmare for Japan, because he would not be at least a convincing leader or convincing commander-in-chief of the United States. So I guess we're doubling down. But personally, I've been trying to convince the Japanese government from outside that we have to see sort of the dark side of Mr. Trump. It's not just about he's tough on China, it's good for Japan. Right? And there's people watching on the other side how we're hugging Mr. Trump. And we have to be aware of that. So I am personally trying to convey that message. But to be honest, that message is not penetrating, because they're so preoccupied with what's happening today. Right? That's how government officials and bureaucrats are. So, and it comes directly from Prime Minister's office. This, because he's comfortable with Mr. Trump. So, that's kind of the answer that I could give.
Hi. So with the recent incidences with the military over the past decade, the Okinawa and drunk driving incidences in the mid-century, along with the collisions happening with the Fitzgerald and McCain and other various aircraft incidences in recent years, does Japan have reason to worry about America's military strength within Japan itself? Even if America is trying to engage with Japan, does that somehow worry Japan about the strength America is able to put out anymore?
Well, in a short to midterm, I guess no. We're more worried about America's sort of will and commitment. We're not worried about America's sort of physical power. So we've just bought F-30, 100 F-35s, right? That is expensive. Right? And we are buying many of the missile defense systems from the US. So in terms of your physical capability, we're not worried. We're worried about the technological sort of competition in terms of AI and drones and quantum computing, and how sort of China sort of poses a threat. But that's not like an immediate thing, right? It's a bit stretched out in the, not a future, but it will take some time at least, right? So it's not about America's physical power. I think America's physical power is still admired. It's overwhelming. Like if there would be a contingency around sort of Japanese territorial waters with a Chinese navy, as of now, maritime self-defense force can pretty much handle it. So we're pretty good as well. And if you add the US component, and we would, at least now, we can overwhelm China, right? But in the longer term, that becomes a bit sketchy. So it's not really about America's sort of physical sort of power, but it's more about American will. How politicians are talking about America's role in the world, and how people like here in the Midwest are talking about America's global role, right? And you don't see a vibrant internationalism, a muscular sort of foreign policy, that America has to be the center of liberal international order, right? That kind of narrative it hasn't totally disappeared, but we feel like it's fading away. And I think that is symbolized by Senator John McCain's death. I mean, it's not about himself. I think it symbolizes that. Bush 41, they were sometimes wrong. Like, McCain as a president or presidential candidate, or I forgot what's the senator, he's a bomb Iraq or something. And President Bush also had some, strategic missteps. But generally, they accepted America as a cornerstone of liberal international order. And they have accepted that role and tried to convince the American public that that is our role. But you don't see that anymore in American sort of, political and intellectual leadership. They bemoan. The role of the intellectuals and the leaders today is bemoan and sort of, what's the verb of nostalgia? You nostalgize about, American, a robust American internationalism. And no one's trying to convince the American public to do that. So, did I answer to your question?
In your lecture, I believe you described Japan, at least in my opinion, in the American definition as inherently liberal. However, I do see some similarities with Japan's consideration of their border with Trump's image of immigration. Do you see his thinkings about immigration resonate in Japan?
That's a tough one, right? Because we have an effective wall. Much more effective one than Mr. Trump is trying to build at the Mexican border, right? It's not a wall, but it's a barrier, right? It's an ocean. So literally no one can come to Japan. And I thank you for reminding me. I forgot to mention the reason why we don't have, one of the reasons why we don't have a populist nationalism, because we're homogenous, right? Because all in other democracies, it's about being uncomfortable about the other. Right? and although Japan is becoming more multicultural compared to a couple of years ago, still, I think compared to other countries, we're homogenous. Right? So we welcome them as guests, visitors, but if they permanently stay, I don't know what's going to happen. But I'm just sounding out my not even an idea, my thought that, just because Japan is a homogeneous society does not necessarily mean that we cannot adapt to diversity. Right? Because for those of you who have visited Japan, Japan is a very secular society. Right? We have our own notion of religion. We're not an atheist society, but it's very different from one God, one religion, type of belief, right? And here, Europe, religion, ethnicity, your beliefs, God, always plays a major role in othering people, right? But in Japan, we have how we look, the color of our hairs, the language. That's part of the othering logic. But if people can sort of adapt to Japan culturally, more or less, not totally, if you can speak the language, there are no strong, effective othering mechanism that would have a religious sort of implication or something like that. So maybe this is more of a wish, right, rather than observation. But I hope, and Japan needs to diversify itself because the population of Japan is going down. We need workers from outside, right? We need young people. If you're interested, please come to Japan, right? And so we need to adapt to that, that process. And I can't give you an answer right now, but it is one of the important reasons why we don't have a populist nationalism now. But hopefully we can adapt because we don't have like a core value system which is related to the other world, the religion. Right? So this is more or less my hope rather than my analysis.
Thank you very much. So I'm wondering, I want to ask about like what was the actual effect of hugging the Trump administration is. Because yes, Japan seems to be dealing with the Trump administration better than the other countries, but Japan has the same similar trade issues with the European countries have, and blah blah blah.
The tariff was imposed.
And things like that. So I'm wondering what's a counterfactual. So if the Abe administration didn't or hadn't embraced the Trump, the Mr. Abe actually hadn't embraced Trump, and if he hadn't played the golf with him or things like that, beyond that, what would have been different? Like would the U.S. had been softer against China, or China would have been more aggressive towards Japan because the U.S. wouldn't come or things like that? What was that?
I totally understand the thrust of your question. And I think you're right. We can't prove anything, right? If he hadn't hugged Trump, if he hadn't gone to the Trump Tower, what would have happened? We don't know. But at least we're not seeing Mr. Trump telling Japan that you have to pay more. Because in terms of our defense budget, there's many ways of calculating it, but we're paying less than Germany, way lower than France or UK. But there hasn't been any demand, right, from the Trump team to spend more on defense spending. We are increasing little by little. So what he had said during the campaign is no longer there. So that may be a result. You don't know. And if Trump is tough on Japan, I don't think the tough on China stance is not the result of Prime Minister Abe hugging Mr. Trump. I think there's a new consensus emerging in Washington that China is a strategic challenge to the US. And Mr. Trump is a bit different from that because he sees China in terms of trade, right? He never really saw China in terms of national security. So the toughness on China is more or less a new consensus within Washington. So I don't think that's the result of Prime Minister Abe's strategic hugging. But if China sees a rift or schism between US and Japan, if China sees Japan having difficulties in managing the alliance, they would surely exploit that. And we would never want to test that case. So I guess that will be my answer, sort of. The trade negotiation has just started this week. And, the Trump's team could have sort of come to us with a maximum demand, but it wasn't. It was, I don't know what's going to happen after this, right? But at least initially, it will be the TPP standard. No tariffs on cars as long as the negotiation is going on. So it's not totally okay, but it's manageable, right? That may be a result of Prime Minister Abe hugging Mr. We don't know, but at least we know that the worst case scenario hasn't happened. So I guess our option would be we would just continue that. Right? I know it's not convincing, but yeah, that would be my answer.
Thank you. So I'm wondering if you can talk more about how China displays its ambition of hegemony in recent years. For example, do you think the proposal of the Belt and Road is a kind of display of China's ambition?
Right. As I said, China never sort of defines its actions in terms of hegemonic ambitions. It always defines in a more softer term. It's the outside world who sees hegemonic ambitions, right? So there's always a discrepancy among how Chinese people see China's future role and how we see in some other outside countries seeing China's role in the region. And one thing that's almost agreeable is that China is not making a lot of friends. They're losing friends. And Xi Jinping and Chinese Communist Party also understands that. They understand that they're doing something wrong. And the something wrong is that whether explicitly or implicitly, they're sending out the message that in the future, we will be the dominant power in this region. And that will be their actions in South China Sea. Belt and Road Initiative is one of them. I think we were over worried about Belt and Road Initiative when it came out. It isn't as effective as we thought. It's creating some frictions in some of the countries. So we've calmed down a bit. So, particular to Japan, our Prime Minister said, if there's an effective way to cooperate with China on BRI in infrastructure building, which is no doubt needed in Asia, right? We would cooperate. So specifically on BRI, the threat perception has somewhat toned down, but still, China's actions, in cyber and how it's encroaching upon American academic institutions. There are worrying trends, and because we are on the side of feeling that, sort of hegemonic ambitions, we tend to hedge against the negative, the impact, right? So we shouldn't be over hostile or over, preparing for these hegemonic rise. But I think there's a strong consensus in Japan and to a certain degree in the region that, there is that kind of ambition in China's actions.
Wonderful. That was fantastic. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Professor Nakayama.
Thank you.